Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your program featuring up-to-date news, views and discussion on religious liberty events. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on this program is Carmela Monk Crawford, editor of Message Magazine. And I've got to be careful I don't mispronounce your magazine, just as I used to edit Listen Magazine, and Listen and Lincoln and Liberty. Yes. Can all get souped together. Right. But thank you for coming again on this program.
It's an honor to be here.
In a previous program, I was casting about and sucking you in from all directions on a topic. But you said something that related to where we are today in weather dislocation and natural disasters and so on. And by the way, I have an email from a well-intentioned Adventist sent me a few weeks ago that I think it was 2 days ago, according to him, a prophetic moment was going to take place where the whole West Coast basically was going to fall into the ocean and so on. So people worry about these things, natural calamities. Our present administration, I think, are in denial, like there's no such thing as global warming. I think many of the ruling parties say, but most people know as they travel around and as they live through life in the US that things are not quite right.
That's right.
How does this relate to a spiritual vision, and how might it relate to continued or lack of continued civil and religious liberties? You got thoughts on this?
I have some thoughts. I do believe that continued civil liberties are implicated by what we're seeing here. I was reading just recently that the United States, the Department of Defense, 76% of the greenhouse gases created by the United States is done by the Department of Defense outside of the United States. Very interesting that our Department of Defense is creating this issue and outside of the borders of the United States.
Through what activities? What sort of activities?
Through its maneuvers, through the testing, wherever it is around the world. And it's not as readily regulated as if it was onshore. What am I trying to say by this? I think that, for one thing, many people in the Christian community do not look at that as an issue that we need to think about. Of course, the Lord wouldn't let us blow up this planet, or the Lord's not going to allow that to happen. Yet we have a stewardship responsibility to make sure that we are taking care of things. But the implications for people, the famines, just like back in biblical times, you have people who don't have access to water, or people who don't have access to food. You'll still have those same movements happening now, and we just don't call it or don't look at it the same way. But
well, the military have figured it out,
yes.
and droughts and natural calamities are part of a security matrix that they're more and more looking at.
Yes.
And in reality, I mean, let's go back to the Bible.
Yes.
Most of the battles were fought over wells and access to a field to plant your grain, which is livelihood. So the world hasn't changed much in that regard.
Basic resources.
And a lot of what's going on in the Middle East. We heard about the Israel taking the Golan Heights from Syria. But what's at play there was not just a strategic place to fire down on the settlements. It was a water source issue. And Israel and Syria have a huge dispute over water, which originates from those mountains there on the Golan Heights. So Syria now is short of the water, but they were denying it to Israel before.
Yeah, think about the day zero without water in Cape Town, South Africa. It was Cape Town.
Yeah.
And just think about it. Then we think about the storms and the implication for people such as in Puerto Rico, and then last year's storms that affected people in Houston and other places where it's not just the what happens in the climate, but what happens socially and structurally. How do we move people out of harm's way, and how do we put them back where they can have a prosperous life, or even just a stable life? And what do we do when we're tired of supplying aid or FEMA support, if FEMA support got to them at all? This is a very big issue, especially for people who do not have the resources to get out of harm's way.
I don't know that this is proven or fully acknowledged, but I think anybody watching had to wonder whether FEMA was less committed to general help or making decisions about where they warranted assistance. And I've quoted on this program before, but it really affected me once. I was watching a news report from the United Nations on population issues and starvation and so on. And the woman at the time in charge of this whole area came out and gave a press conference, and she said, "We have become like God. We will decide who will live and who will die." So if you choose to help this area but not this, you're making a choice for that those people are expendable. Mm-hmm. And I think clearly it's just logical. With limited resources, governments and the world is probably going to have to make these choices as to what's important. And part of the choice I think they've already signaled is that certain liberties may be a luxury we can't allow in a time of stress.
Don't you believe, though, that more than a question of resource limits is a question of priority setting?
Well, that's what I was saying.
That's what you were saying.
A certain group may, like in Myanmar,
right,
they have decided the Rohingya are not on their list.
Right.
They don't want to give them education or any social support. You know, the Revelation talks about a group that can neither buy nor sell because they hold out against a global system. Mm-hmm. And if you read it superficially, well, it's just lashing out and persecuting these groups. But maybe someone objects to the priorities that are set in a modern world, and they increase their marginalisation and they're just put off to the side. Yeah. There's a document that I know you and I have discussed. I don't know how well you've read it. The Pope's document on the environment. I'm trying to think of the Latin name. They all have Latin names, but mm-hmm. it's the environmental document, and quite unique for a spiritual leader. He's tackling a civil problem and addressing it to all people, not just religious people. Mm-hmm. And he says there, if we don't solve this problem of the environment, we're all going to die. And his solution, which I like from the Bible, is that we need to honour the rhythms inscribed in nature.
I thought that was interesting.
In Genesis is a day of rest.
Yes.
But it then quickly devolves into how do you celebrate that day? And while his theology is okay, his application is horribly flawed because he recognises the seventh-day Sabbath. But then Sunday is fine enough for him. Right. But I'd be very uncomfortable if someone says it's the seventh-day Sabbath. Therefore, globally, we will all obey the Sabbath. It would still be anti-religious liberty.
Right, right.
But we're clearly heading to a point where, you know, the ancients came at it pretty easy. You know, the storm came in last night. The gods are angry with us.
Right.
We know that's not functionally quite correct. But when the calamities increase and we become spiritual, hoping that God will show us favour somehow, you don't want a group that worship differently that seem to be thwarting your revival.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
I can see the lay of the land very, very clearly now.
Yes.
So we're not just talking about a military issue. We're not just talking about a FEMA relief. We're talking about the continuation of the right of people to think and worship differently. I'm positive. It's just around the corner.
There. The connection is there. And I think what is said, you know, when I'm thinking, I go a different viewpoint, because when you're talking about how there are certain people set up and marginalized and left vulnerable, I think of the families who live around big business, big farms, big like chicken plants and things like that. That's a whole nother situation.
I'll give you, people might have forgotten now, but one word, Bhopal.
Yes, I remember that.
I mean, in India, I forget the factory, but there was a factory, and thousands of people around it were many died, but their very existence was threatened by this machine or this factory. And in reality, I mean, you know, the dark satanic mills of, was it William Blake in England? The whole Industrial Revolution is premised on that idea that some people are going to be sacrificed for our progress.
Right, right. And we see that today, like we say, with these large, in the large farms that are creating, and they're spraying manure around, and it affects the health of the people who live there. They're just expended for the purposes of this, the progress of this business and this industry. I don't know, and I can't say what the end point is and what will lead and how it will stack up. But we can say, as we watch this, and I think you made that point in an earlier program, that we can say that things are stacking up, and it does not require your hold or your degree in prophecy to be able to see that things are stacking up, and the vulnerability of so many people right now.
But it does require a little mental attention for someone to understand this.
It should.
The vast majority of people don't connect the dots on this, so they're just sort of responding to events, and they're going to be easily led. And you know, you mentioned prophecy, and that's a subtext to a lot of what we say on religious liberty. You're not saved by prophecy.
No.
No Christian preacher legitimately ever made such a claim, but you can be lost by a wrong view on it, or not knowing prophecy, because it will lead you in a wrong direction. So I think people need to be informed about the world around them and to see how that does logically link to a prophetic outline, and when the false calls for conformity come, they'll resist it.
Right.
Because yes, our survival as a species, I think, is very soon to be at the point of open threat.
Yes.
But the solution is not to destroy spiritual sensibility, because, you know, people have known it through the ages. You might live physically, but if you've destroyed your soul, you've gained nothing.
Right, right.
And, you know, and God has promised something beyond this. But we're at the point where people are going to be offered that choice. You think differently and survive, or if you worship differently than we say, you're a consumer. Right. You're a redundant person. And the US has been that route before. It's seen whole peoples as not worthy of the vote. I mentioned to you this morning before the program that I just watched something recently on the Chinese experience. They were seen as subhumans, not humans, not welcome in this country by law from the 1800s right till 1943. They were forbidden to come here.
Yes.
So you don't have to imagine some dystopian future where even in the westernized democracy like the US, we will have these draconian laws. We've had them already.
Yes. And sadly, there are plenty of people who are still subject to what we would see as unfair and just systematically unjust structures.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing those right now. And I agree, this is the kind of thing that you have to wake up to and start putting some stock into it.
Yeah, you're right on this, and I appreciate your comment. You know, what I'm reminded of, and the Bible says to do justly, to seek justice. That's a very important part of seeking God. We have to be concerned about how other people live, and how laws and principles of human freedom are applied to them. We can't think, well, it's fine, that all exists, and take me, God.
Right.
Right.
Take me.
Now, I'm a little concerned about any church, particularly my own church, getting wholesale involved in social justice, because that can become an end in itself. We can't create heaven on earth, but we cannot let injustice stand. We need to speak to it. We need to draw people out from that, but pull them on to the promised land, back to Exodus. We're moving somewhere. Right. We can never sort this place out. And I'm trying to sort of draw on history to make comments, but I know you can't unravel history. It's baggage you take with you. We'll be back after a break. Stay with us, and we'll continue this discussion. Thank you. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break with Carmela Monk Crawford. And I always do with hesitation because I first knew you before you were married.
That's right.
Carmela Monk.
Carmela Monk.
So I have to think carefully. But before the break, we were wandering through the interesting fields of how we respond to emergencies and disasters and the military and the civil liberty applications. The US has been through some of that territory, I think, and Christians showed that it was important for them to respond and to be in the leadership of dealing with huge social ills that had structural components. Even the civil rights movement, I think, was a coming of age, if you like, of Christian activism. Well, not really coming of age, because the abolitionist movement clearly had a huge Christian involvement.
Right.
But in the modern era, the civil rights movement did give an opportunity for people of faith to step up and speak out.
It did give an opportunity for some. Sadly,
Some.
not everybody took that
I
opportunity.
didn't say they all did.
Right. Well, and even now, you know, I was listening to what you said before the break, and I agree. We cannot create heaven on earth. The sad thing about it is that for people who are not affected by these social ills, it is just too easy to be complacent on earth. And not only not fight for equal access and equal justice, but to demean and criminalize the people and marginalize, your word, marginalize the people who do. And I think that, you know, this is one of those things where you really have to get involved and be vocal about what is happening on a social basis, especially for people who it may not happen to, or things don't happen. I may be different from you. We both have sons. As a black mother of 2 black sons, it is important to me when I think about it, and we live in the same community. My children, when they ride their bicycles, and if they go around the neighborhood or if they go to school, it's a different feel than what I would expect could happen. Although, you know, it could happen to your son as well.
My son's been stopped a lot of times, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
The fear is there, and I don't know, and I guess we're
he's
talking
told me that in Hagerstown, where we live, he's been out wandering on his bicycle and the police have stopped him. Why are you here? What are you doing? That's not good.
No.
My very first introduction to the United States, very first, the day we arrived, we stayed in Tacoma Park in apartments our church provided, and I was 16. And I went out running, and the police stopped me.
Yeah.
And very prejudicially, and they said, what are you doing? Because I didn't even speak the patois. I said, well, I'm staying in the flats over there, apartments. But they looked at me, what sort of language? And they said, we're looking for someone who committed a robbery. You match the description. And right away I realized I'm a suspect. That was the very day. So I know young people generally, but yes, there's no question, young black men, the police will...
You are fortunate to have those, you know, from my point of view, it helps that these things have happened to you. It helps that you could see that someone would make a distinction based on your accent, or your new coming to a place, or that your children. But these are the kinds of things, and I guess I'm going back to...
Well, there was a case recently.
Yes.
An elderly gentleman from India went out walking, and the police stopped him, and he didn't speak English properly, and they ended up, I think they shot him.
They shot, I don't, is that the case where they shot? Was that in Alabama?
No, but this was about a year, within the last year. No, it wasn't that
sadly, I mean, I kind of chuckle at that.
And these are misunderstandings on the face of it, but there's an underlying attitude that kicks in more here than some Western countries. And I know what you're talking about with your sons, absolutely.
Right, so as we see these things, you know, you're talking about things lining up, and we can't make this a heaven on earth, but we do see that the path is laid out for people to be stopped unnecessarily, for people to excuse it for their own security or for their own bias or whatever reason. And so we see those things coming to pass very easily right now.
I still think a Christian should speak out on it. When injustice is done to other people, we shouldn't say, well, it's not us, it's not me. You know,
or that, you know, when Jesus comes back, this will all be taken care of and you can't fix it now. That's what I hear more often.
But I was going to jump at something, and
I'm sorry.
I don't know the reaction I'll get from you. It's before my time, but I love music, and it impressed me. Paul Robeson, an icon of American music, had his passport taken away from him. He was not allowed to travel because he spoke out for freedom. You know that, right? That doesn't fit the pattern of American thinking, that it's somewhere else that someone's restricted, not here. And I connect funny dots sometimes. It troubles me that even in our own Christian community, many people are in a great rush to go to Russia or Latin America somewhere and go for mission service. May not be too good in their own town.
No.
There's great injustices, great spiritual darkness, but they're not willing to recognize it because it doesn't touch them. They're willfully ignorant, so they just think, you know, I'll go help them there. They may not want your help there, but they sure need it in the not always the nicest part of town. And the town we live in, I better be careful. I don't want to give a bad name to Hagerstown. But, you know, there's huge swatches of Hagerstown that, in my view, are beyond the pale and could use great help.
Right, right. Well, you know, that reminds me of, we've done some stories for Message Magazine around the idea of police mistreatment and police abuse. And for me, I've shared the story with people, church folks, and you get two reactions. You know, some people are very, yes, we need to talk about this because this has happened to me, this has happened to my family. But the other reaction is, these are good people, we shouldn't even be talking about it because you give them a bad name. And I think there has to be a medium in which we tell the truth. And that is very important right now, to tell the truth, recognize the issue, and confront it, and then fix it. Fix it as far as you can.
I'll throw in something that may get me into trouble. I don't think so.
But as long as you get you, not me, in trouble.
But go back to, in another program, I mentioned the Democratic National Convention in 1968. The police there behaved in ways that we certainly wouldn't accept it now in a wholesale manner. I mean, when you see the videos, unreal, just wailing away with blood and broken bones right, left and center, and abusing hundreds of young people who were probably bothering their sense of law and order, but they weren't any imminent threat to the police. But it was incredible police brutality. Were they worse policemen than today? I don't think so. They had been given a signal, in fact, direct instructions from a leadership. This is what you are to do. And the police today are generally well-meaning people. They're professionals, most of them. But they will take their cues from what they expect, that they think the government expects them to do and society expects them to do. No more, no less, generally speaking.
Right.
And if they think this society is comfortable with them roughing up people in a neighborhood that the society wishes wasn't there, they'll do it.
And isn't that sadly the case?
Right, so we can throw a signal. If the Christian community make it very plain that this is not morally acceptable, it will start to fade away.
And I love how you say this. A few years ago, I talked to Michelle Alexander, the author of the book, The New Jim Crow, when she explores the idea of mass incarceration. And I asked her, I says, you know, and along your same lines, I said, you know, I think part of the reason why the Christian community has not weighed in on mass incarceration is because there's something in us that says, well, these people who are in the system kind of deserve it, don't they? Or these people who are jailed are there because they did something that warranted that. And then how do we, you know, mobilize everybody to come to their defense? And she said, well, you have to, because you know that the system is broken. And unless you say something, you cannot correct it. Well, how can you correct a massive system like this? Well, how did they connect the issue during slavery time? How did they connect the issue at slavery time? If they could get an idea of how they could run away, escape, or fight for justice and freedom, we have to do the same thing.
As late as the mid-60s, The Reverend Martin Luther King, in his advancement of the civil rights agenda, famously gave a speech where he said that the moral arm of the universe may be long, but it bends toward justice. And of course, Message magazine has inherited that call to justice for a subset of the American population, but really all religious liberty endeavors, all civil rights endeavors should be arguing for justice. And all true religion, as the Bible says, is to do justly. But of course, the question is, what is justice? What is right? And unless it has a divine origin, it's very subjective and very variable. Do right, do justly, and walk before the Lord and acknowledge Him. That is the root of true freedom. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.